The graduation ceremony on Station Korvac 7 was meant to be a moment of unity. 300 cadets from 47 species stood in perfect formation beneath the dome's artificial sky, each one having survived 4 brutal years of the Galactic Defense Academy. But unity, Cadet Arlen Hayes had learned, was a word that meant different things to different species. "Kneel," Commander Thexel had ordered, his mandibles clicking with barely concealed disgust. Arlen had looked up at the Vrathari commander, confusion flickering across his weathered human face. Around him, cadets from across the galaxy stood at attention, their postures rigid with military discipline. No one else was being asked to kneel. "I said kneel, human." Thexel's voice carried across the silent assembly. "Your species enters this alliance as subordinates. You will show proper deference." The words landed like physical blows. Humanity had fought for 20 years to earn a seat at the galactic table, had bled on distant worlds to prove their worth. And now, at the moment of his graduation, Arlen was being reduced to a symbol of humiliation. His jaw tightened. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to stand tall, to fight. But he'd learned something in 4 years among the stars. Sometimes strength meant choosing your battles. Sometimes survival meant swallowing pride. Slowly, Arlen lowered himself to his knees. The shame burned hotter than any star. He could feel 300 pairs of eyes on him, some filled with pity, others with satisfaction. His hands clenched into fists against his thighs as Commander Thexel stepped closer, towering over him. "This is the natural order," the commander announced to the assembly. "Humanity's place in our great alliance, but Thexel had made a miscalculation, one that would cost him everything." In the third row of assembled cadets stood Rakir, barely 4 feet tall, covered in silver-gray fur that marked him as a juvenile Keshatar, one of the apex predator species that ruled 3 sectors of known space. At only 16 cycles old, he was the youngest cadet to ever graduate from the academy. His people had sent him as a test, to see if the soft species of the galaxy could teach a Keshatar anything worth knowing. They had not expected him to develop a conscience. Rakir had watched Arlen Hayes for 4 years. He'd seen the human volunteer for the most dangerous training exercises, pulling Rakir himself from a collapsing simulator when the cub's overconfidence had nearly killed him. He'd watched Arlen share his rations with cadets from species that couldn't digest standard station fare. He'd observed the human study late into the night, working twice as hard as anyone else because Earth's educational systems were still catching up to galactic standards, and now he watched that same human kneel in humiliation because Commander Thexel belonged to a species that had been conquering others for 10,000 years and couldn't bear to see newcomers treated as equals. Something inside the young Keshtar snapped. Rakir moved with the liquid grace his species was famous for, covering the distance to the commander in 3 silent bounds. His claws, still juvenile but wickedly sharp, extended with an audible snick that cut through the ceremonial silence. "Commander," Rakir's voice was soft, almost gentle, but it carried the weight of ancient authority. "I believe there has been a mistake." Thexel spun, his compound eyes widening as he registered the predator cub at his side. Cadet Rakir returned to... "No." The single word froze the commander mid-sentence. Rakir's silver eyes gleamed with something that made even Thexel's military bearing falter. "Wrong knees, Commander. Wrong species." The cub circled slowly, his tail lashing with barely contained fury. Every cadet in the assembly knew what Rakir was. A juvenile member of a species that had never been conquered, never been subjugated, never bowed to anyone. The Keshatar were diplomats because they chose to be, not because they had to be. "You see," Rakir continued, his voice carrying across the stunned silence, "I have studied human history. Do you know what I learned, Commander? I learned that they have been enslaved by their own kind, conquered by their own kind, forced to kneel by their own kind for thousands of years, and yet somehow impossibly they kept getting back up." He stopped directly in front of Thexel, and despite the height difference, despite his youth, there was no question who held power in that moment. They clawed their way to the stars from a single planet with no guidance, no alliance, no help. They built engines that broke physics because no one told them it was impossible. And when they finally reached us, reached you, you decided to make one of them kneel? Rakir's claws tapped against the polished floor, a rhythmic sound that echoed like a countdown. "So I will correct your mistake, Commander. You kneel now. Thexel's mandibles opened in protest. I am a senior officer of the... You are currently standing within range of a Keshatar, cub who is feeling very disappointed in your species' diplomatic approach. Rakir's voice dropped to a purr that somehow felt more threatening than any roar. My sire sits on the Galactic Council. My clutch mother commands the Third Fleet, and I am telling you to kneel. Now. The threat was implicit but crystal clear. The Vrithari might be ancient conquerors, but the Keshatar were apex predators who had shaped galactic politics for longer than most species had possessed fire. One word from Rakir to his family, and the Vrithari's comfortable position in the Alliance would become very uncomfortable indeed. Commander Thexul's legs bent. Slowly, with his entire body trembling with suppressed rage, he lowered himself to the ground. Rakir turned to Arlen, extending a clawed hand. Get up, Cadet Hayes, you kneel to no one. Not today. Not ever again. Arlen took the offered hand, so small yet impossibly strong, and rose to his feet. Around them, the assembly remained frozen, witnesses to a moment that would ripple through the Alliance for decades to come. You see, Commander, Rakir said, not even looking at the kneeling officer, you taught me something valuable today. You taught me that the measure of a species is not in how they treat their equals, but in how they treat those they perceive as lesser. By that measure, I choose to stand with humanity. The young Keshatar's silver eyes swept across the assembled cadets, many of whom were now looking at Arlen, and at Earth's few other representatives with new understanding. Let this be a lesson to all of us, Rakir announced. The humans have a saying, do not mistake kindness for weakness. I suggest we all remember it. As Commander Thexul was finally allowed to rise and slink away in disgrace. As the graduation ceremony resumed with an entirely different atmosphere, Arlen Hayes felt something shift in the galaxy's perception of his species. They had not won respect through Arlen's humiliation. They had won it through a cub's courage to speak truth to power. And that, Arlen realized, was perhaps the most human thing of all. That sometimes it took an outsider to see humanity's true strength, and to refuse to let it be diminished by ancient prejudices. The ceremony continued, but nothing would ever be quite the same.